Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are currently watching from, welcome to the first Future Food Tech webinar in our series. I'm Oliver Katz, the conference producer, talking to you from my living room in a grey and rainy England. As the current pandemic disrupts plans across the world and forces many of us to socially distance, here at Rethink, we still want to give a platform to leading innovators to share their groundbreaking insights, challenge the status quo, and connect the wider food ecosystem together. Now more than ever, it is vital we continue to collaborate towards a stronger, more sustainable, and nutritious future. So, kickstarting this series of online interactive sessions, we've invited three key players from INDIEBIO, Impossible Foods, Temasek, to deep dive into the microbial revolution that's happening in our food system and its promise to deliver cheaper, more sustainable food with optimal functionality. So I'm sure this isn't your first webinar. Most likely you've probably already watched half a dozen this week. But in terms of format, we have 3 short presentations from our speakers, followed by 1 or 2 questions posed to each of them from you, the audience. So please post your questions in the Ask a Question section located at the bottom right of your screen. You can also upvote these questions. So the more upvoted the question, the more likely it will be asked to the speakers. So after the presentations and direct questions, there will be a group discussion which Arvind will lead. And these will also incorporate some live questions until we wrap up on the hour. So please feel free to use the comment section to virtually welcome our speakers up to the stage, or simply clap and whoop in the comfort of your own home. So, or throw down a dance, whatever suits. So, and finally, if you do experience any technical issues, please also comment in the chat. One of my team, Pierrick or Elliot, will be able to assist you with those issues. Hopefully not, though, fingers crossed. So without further ado, I would love to welcome up our first speaker, Arvind Gupta, to the virtual stage. Welcome, Arvind. So Arvind founded INDIEBIO, the world's largest biotech program-based seed fund, which is part of SOSV, and using a blend of scientific method and design thinking, Arvind and the INDIEBIO team fund startups that can impact over 1 billion people or address markets over $1 billion. And some of the companies that have come through the program include Memphis Meats, the Knot Company, Clara Foods, and Prime Roots. So over to you, Arvind. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So first of all, I'm just thrilled to be able to speak with you all. Normally it's from a stage in San Francisco. This, watching the chat roll through and just seeing so many old friends, it's really great to have this community. Thank you, Oliver, for putting this together and getting all the technology aligned and giving us this forum to convene in. And so, yeah, what I would love to do is I'll talk to you guys about some of our fermentation technologies specifically. I don't want to, at INDIEBIO, we look at disrupting the entire food supply chain using a variety of technologies. But specifically today, I'll focus on microbial fermentation. So I'm going to go ahead and see if this works. I'm going to share my screen and then go over to share your entire screen. Yeah. Okay, share. And then I'm going to go over to your screen sharing. Okay. And I'm going to go over here. Can you guys see this? Uh-oh. Can you guys see the presentation?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. You awesome. Oliver, you can see it right now? Yes, you should be able to.
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Okay, so INDIEBIO, if you haven't heard, is a biotech accelerator. What we do is we fund companies. We want to be the very first check in, and we provide a program which helps scientists make the transition from from academia or early stage business formation to really being an entrepreneur that can do hundreds of millions of revenue over time. And so we have over 116 companies that we've funded to date. These companies in 5 years are worth $2.3 billion today. This is an incredibly, not just large number, but incredibly distributed across all of those 116 companies. It's not with one outlier. I think what we've seen is really incredible overall value creation. 65% of these of the companies we fund raise a qualified financing after graduating in INDIEBIO. We have 36 countries represented by our founders, and really what I'm proud of is 43% of our co-founders are women in our cohorts. So I'd like to talk about, INDIEBIO's, the way we think about microbial fermentation is really thinking about what we call the workhorses. In other words, what are the chassis that you could use to produce different types of proteins or foods? If you have mammalian cells, avian marine cells, really that's on the muscle production side of things. So Memphis Meats for a variety of different land-based meats. Finless Foods is focusing on tuna and fish. New Age Meats is focusing on pork. We go to, and that's the cell-based meat stuff. Then we go to the more traditional fermentation technologies, yeast, single cell fungi that give rise to Clara Foods, which was the very first batch of INDIEBIO, Prime Roots, Microma, Pando Nutrition, Sugar Logics, Miraculix. Then on bacteria, as a chassis, we have companies like Geltor, New Culture, Perfect Day, Nova Nutrients, and Proterra, which is a protein design company, but then uses this chassis to do their production. We don't want to leave out algae, which is very good for also creating seafood-based types of products, New Wave Foods and Blue Planet, producing food from scratch. And then plant stem cells is something that's really new for us. So Kai Botanic is able to differentiate the actual protoplasts that are producing compounds of interest, and really able to make those at a lower cost. So these aren't theoretical companies, obviously. The companies we fund always get to a de-risking event, which includes a tasting. This is Prime Roots bacon. You can already buy it. It'll be widespread later here, available across the Bay Area and hopefully the nation later on this year. It cooks up like bacon, but this is not bacon. This is not made from an animal. Obviously, this is made from their protein, their fungi protein. New Culture is a company that is making cheese, but not from nuts or seeds or things like that. They're doing it by fermenting the actual proteins needed for micellar formation in the bacteria that is generally used in the starter culture. So it's a very clever way of creating cheese that actually is has all the properties of actual cheese, but not having a cow involved. Geltor is a well-known animal-free collagen company. I think they have really helped to understand business model designs where you can approach scale by understanding how to get to market in a way that gets you to early revenue. and then drives down the cost curve over time. An extremely strong team and an extremely great product, already being used in makeups around the world. New Wave Foods is now a Tyson Ventures-backed company that is making shrimp from algae, and the amount of traction they're getting is rather incredible. They have a really strong focus on product design, which is allowing them to iterate quickly and get again to market. Clara Foods is high performance egg whites, what I call performance proteins without the chicken. So how do you take all the egg white proteins and recombine them in a way that makes highly functional foods that can be tailored to specific applications? So here you see meringues that were made with their performance egg whites. Microbial is a company in one of our more recent classes that is making all natural food dyes and colorants through fermentation, fungal fermentation. This is a food dye that is that's heat stable, chemical stable, pH stable. It has a wide variety of applications. They have all the warmer hues of orange, yellows, and reds, and they're now working on the cooler hues of blues, greens. So we're really excited by them because what they can do is provide a clean label for foods and products that are normally made with food dyes that are synthetic. Miraculex is another one that people probably have heard of and met. Incredible team with Alwyn, Karen, and Jason Ryder from Just. They're making a protein sweetener which actually binds to the taste buds of your tongue, and then fires the signals that go to your brain and says this is sweet. But it's a protein with minimal calories. These proteins come from the miraculin berry, is generally regarded as safe, and they have a way of creating and making these proteins through fermentation that allows it to be scaled. They're a platform company that's looking at all protein sweeteners to be able to revolutionize the way we actually taste sweet, and hopefully be able to put a real dent in the obesity and diabetic epidemic that's sweeping the nation. Of course, Perfect Day, one of the OGs of the entire space, making whey protein without the cow through fermentation, has sold out in hours their first batch of ice cream, which I've tasted, is incredible, and they continue to execute beautifully. And so I'm very excited. You've probably all heard the announcement that they got a no questions asked on their recent FDA GRAS application, which is a tremendous milestone for the entire field. I believe what this shows is the FDA's willingness to say protein is protein, and we don't need to worry ourselves with the pseudo scientific concerns of what if it came from a GMO organism, is that gonna cause a problem? So very exciting news from the FDA on that. Sugar Logics is a company that is working on what I think is a frontier of nutrition, which is mining human breast milk for the incredible richness of nutrients and drugs specifically that are bioactive in the body. And human milk oligosaccharides are a difficult one to produce. It's hard, of course, it's hard to isolate them because the world supply of human breast milk is not huge. And so they're expressing 2FL and in bacteria or yeast, and really able to produce this for infant formulas and for other drinks. 2FL is incredibly helpful for lowering inflammation and have a bunch of other microbiome beneficial effects. Proterra is using, I mentioned Proterra earlier, they're using AI to really find perfectly edible and great proteins to help in food formulations. And so these are then expressed in bacteria or yeast in order to service multinational customers and their production facilities. Finally, one of the things that we're all, everyone in this industry and field is extremely interested in is making sure that our yields continue to go up. Yield is one of those things that makes or breaks a company. And so we're looking at companies that could specifically just increase yield. So Simica is a company we just funded, very excited about, that can actually, using a variety of tricks, help improve fermentation in batch fermenters. This is something we're constantly thinking about and constantly looking for exciting new innovations, and Simica is bringing that to the table. So stay tuned, more to come on this company. The oceans is a particular focus for INDIEBIO. It's not an easy area to tackle. The oceans are large. We don't know much about the oceans relative to land, but the just incredible amount of biomass and its regulatory effect on Earth climate is something that makes it an area we look into at all times. Novo Nutrients is a company that is able to make fish meal from CO2 that is being waste expelled into the atmosphere by various types of factories. It's a ingenious way of making this food, and so I'm just really excited to see here. Their progress continues at a rapid pace, and they're just raising their Series A now. So very, very excited to see new ways of making proteins, not just from the traditional feedstocks, but what are other new types of feedstocks that we can use to produce foods. There's no reason why what Novo Nutrients is doing can't produce food for humans as well. We're also thinking about fermentation in a different way, thinking about how do we ferment things inside of animals to make those animals better for the environment. That's exactly what Pando Nutrition is doing. They have an organism that can basically be used to make antibiotics inside the natural antibiotics, what they call panzymes, inside the cow to reduce the bacteria that could produce methane emissions, basically making methane-free cows. Our goal is to curb climate change, and we look for every single possible avenue using biology as technology to do so. And along those lines, Electroactive is using microbial electrolysis to take food waste and generate electricity. These are two incredible scientists out of the Oak Ridge National Labs. This is a lab that gave us nuclear energy and producing hydrogen using that electrolysis. And that hydrogen then goes back into the cycle to power city buses and things like that. So I just wanted to give a quick brief overview of some of the things that INDIEBIO are doing focused in fermentation. Please, I'm excited for all of you to go try these products. We're all fans of this type of technology, and let me switch back over here. And so, hold on. How do I? Your screen sharing, click. Let's see, come back to here. Does that work? Oops, no. There we go. So I'm excited to share these technologies. Thank you so much for listening, and excited to have a longer conversation with you later.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Arvind. That was really interesting. Great to hear more about those companies. And so a couple of the questions that are coming out. So one of them, most of the companies are focused on providing an alternative to animal-based food. What about the nutritional value of all the cheeses, the bacon, and the egg alternatives? Are they nutritionally sound? Are they better than the animal counterparts?
Yeah, great question. But thank you so much, whoever asked that. It's something, what we don't want to do is replace these animal proteins with something that is bad for people's health. And that's something that, it's processed foods are generally worse for people's health than natural whole foods. And so when we're looking at these alternatives, what we're trying to do here is make alternatives that can fit into people's lives in a one-to-one way, nutritionally, functionally, as well as aesthetically. So prime roots bacon, for instance, has an extremely high protein content because the protein source they're using is naturally high in protein. And it slices, it looks raw, it cooks. And so when you start to look at these types of things, that's what we're really trying to do. We don't want consumers to have to change their behavior. Consumers are very bad at changing their behavior. And so the more a company can figure out how to fit their product into a person's lifestyle, which includes these days something that's more healthy, that includes being able to cook it and make it feel like a natural whole food as opposed to a processed food that you pull out of a box and just, put in your mouth, right? Like you want that feeling because it is food. It is not a pill, so to speak. Not that, if someone could come up with eating a pill that gives you all the nutritional, I would be very interested in that. So call me if you have that. But I think to directly answer the question, that's why our the cheese company we funded, New Culture, has an approach that is an identical nutritional profile to real cheese.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. And then secondly, a lot of questions around regulation of these technologies. As you mentioned, Perfect Day was approved by the FDA. So are there any other recommendations that you'd give to startups in this space to ensure that they're approved by the FDA or have a great chance, don't pump loads of money into a product and kind of fail that process?
Man, you're getting to the heart of, I think, what's going to be the most interesting question in the next 10 years in this space. What is GRAS, right? So generally, if you have a sequence or a structure that is identical to something found in nature, and that molecule that is found in nature has been widely consumed by humans for many, many, many years, then you will most likely pass. There's probably very little reason why you wouldn't pass. Now, when you start altering those things to improve a certain profile, let's just say, oh, we could make this protein slicker in the mouth, or we could make it sweeter. We could do something to it that improves a profile. That starts to become a question. Is this now something so novel that humans have never tasted before? In which case, the FDA will step in and say, we might want to do more testing on this, not just on safety, which is generally, some of the GRAS stuff, but like, what's the line between a drug, right? Which is the full FDA clinical trial pathway, all that kind of stuff, to make the claims that drugs get, and just simply like, oh yeah, rubber stamp, this is something we've seen all the time. Is it one amino acid different, right? Is it 50 amino acids? This is a big question that I think will be answered through conversation and public discourse.
Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you so much for answering those questions, and I'm sure at the end there'll be time for a couple more. Perfect. So now I would love to welcome to the stage our next speaker, Ranjani Varadan. She is the Vice President of R&D at Impossible Foods. I'm sure you've all heard of them by now. The Redwood City-based startup that creates those delicious plant-based meat products for a more sustainable system. And after meeting Pat Brown, as a scientist, she felt compelled to find new ways to develop plant-based meats and revolutionize the meat production system. So currently, she leads the Impossible's R&D efforts aimed at understanding how plant-based ingredients can be used to create a variety of textures and flavors for the next generation of products. So welcome.
Thank you, Oliver, for the kind introduction and for organizing this. I know the organizers had to move the event a couple of times and finally settle on a webinar. So it's great to be here. It's great to see so many people. And I think the audience got a good overview of microbial technologies in food with Arvind's talk. So I'm going to share my screen here and tell you a little bit about what Impossible Foods does. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen?
Can't see it right now, no.
Not yet, no.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Click to voice message. Is it still a split screen?
So hide that, and then if you just press maybe present in the top right by, yeah, perfect. That should let it full screen.
Okay, so Impossible's role in the revolutionizing of the food system by microbial technologies. So, you know, Arvind gave a very good overview of the various companies coming up in the space for using microbial technologies in food. Impossible Foods has focused on meat, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But meat obviously is you know, widely consumed in people's diets. It's a great source of protein. There's a lot of cultural and personal experience associated with eating meat. And it's a huge market, and the consumption of meat is just growing globally. But the way that the meat are produced for human consumption via industrialized animal agriculture is very, very destructive to the environment. I don't think I need to go into the details of that with this audience, but it's huge amount of land area, over a quarter of the fresh water, one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, and also leading to decline in biodiversity, particularly in hotspots. So the way food has been produced for centuries and thousands of years has not changed, right? Humans have been raising animals for food, and as the demand for meat is growing, especially in developing countries, we can't keep up with simply just scaling the animal agriculture. So we have to think about this very differently. So about 10 years ago, Pat Brown founded Impossible Foods with a mission to restore biodiversity and reduce the impact of climate change. And the approach he took was to say, okay, you create a compelling alternative for consumers to choose from, and then the market will decide. So if the alternative is compelling enough, people will switch. And I think in today's times, the mission is particularly relevant as well. You know, we talk about planet health and climate change a lot, and how that's tied to the food system. Obviously, food is also consumed by people for nutrition, and people make very health conscious choices at times as well. But I think the pandemic we are in today illustrates that food system is also tied to public health, because there is foodborne illnesses and superbugs that are also coming out more and more frequently as human contact with wild increases. And so I think particularly it's an interesting time to have this sort of discussion. And Impossible has built a team over the last 9 or 10 years, and focusing on building a technology platform to make various types of meats. Our first product is ground beef, and we are looking at aspects of texture, flavor, nutrition. I think we just had a question about how nutritionally equivalent is the alternative. So we focus on all of these, and like Arvind said, we want to provide an alternative to the consumer that is as good as the food you're trying to replace. So for ground meat, we want to replace or exceed the nutritional components from meat itself. And then appearance and cooking experience, I think this is a new feature in many plant-based foods. More and more you see companies trying to replicate the entire experience of handling, cooking, and playing, so to speak, with the product in the consumer's hands. I think if you look at meat alternatives maybe 20 years ago in the market, that was not the case. And as Arvind said, there are many components where microbial technologies have a role to play. So for instance, he highlighted several companies that are producing proteins as either main components of the foods that they're trying to replace, whether it's eggs from Clara Foods or Perfect Days milk proteins. And then there are also other players in this space, right? So for example, there are people who are using single cell proteins to create textured materials. There are efforts to try to use microbial technologies to improve the functional properties of your starting material as well. On the nutrition side, we saw some references to sweeteners, and there are also, I saw in the audience, people had questions about prebiotics and probiotics. So there's a lot of innovation in that space. Those are related to flavor as well. We'll talk about how Impossible specifically using microbial technologies, and that has to do with our use of heme. So heme is a very important component of the characteristic taste of and aroma associated with meat, with red meat in particular. So it's the combination of amino acids, sugars, fats, and vitamins that only when you react with heme, you're getting this explosion of flavors that you recognize characteristic of red meat. And so heme we are very familiar with heme as the oxygen carrying molecule in our blood, whether it's hemoglobin or oxygen carrying molecule in our muscle tissue, which is what makes muscle red, and that's myoglobin. Now, it turns out that heme is actually ubiquitous. It's found everywhere in nature, and plants have heme also. And I have a picture here of root nodules of a soybean plant. So if you pull up a soy plant, you see the roots have these nitrogen-fixing nodules. And if you crack one open, it's pink like this. So that's because it contains leg hemoglobin, leg for legume. But pulling out soy plants or any legume plants to get enough leg hemoglobin for use in plant-based meats is not sustainable. So Impossible is producing leg hemoglobin using microbial fermentation, yeast fermentation. I'm showing you a picture here of the parent strain, and after upregulation of both the cofactor and the polypeptide itself, we are recovering enough leg hemoglobin to support production of Impossible meat at commercial scale. So our first product is the Impossible burger, but we'd like to extend the technology to make many different types of meats. It's entirely made from plants. And I think it's a great proof of concept. It's obviously far, far, far better for the environment than the animal equivalent. And we hope that that provides the consumers with a good choice, with a compelling alternative that they could choose. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions. Let me see if I can come back here.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Really insightful. Great to hear more about Impossible. And the couple of questions that are coming through. So how are you responding to the growing need for clean label in Impossible Foods?
So we do pay a lot of attention to the ingredients that we select and use. I think consumers are getting more and more savvy about looking at the label and making their choices. So our philosophy is to be transparent about what we use and educate the consumers about what we use and why we use it. I think people tend to be a little bit concerned if they don't understand what's on the label. But I think transparency and being forthcoming about why you're using a certain ingredient is important. Everything we use is safe, is approved for use in food. So it's definitely something we look at.
Great. And what will be required to bring the price down to equal or even lower than real meat prices at the moment?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I think we need a lot of economy of scale. So fundamentally, because we are not going from the feedstock to an animal intermediate to the final meat, inherently the process is going to be more economical. But until all the supply chains and our own ability to produce this at scale improves, I think we are going to see, it's just a matter of time, I think, for
Right.
come down.
Perfect. And finally, your thoughts on how you see tech leaders accounting for climate change-induced food security on raw ingredients in the supply chain. So, as climate change continues to take hold, how are you sourcing your materials, and how do you think that may disrupt some of the products that you offer?
That's a good question. I think particularly in today's environment, we don't know yet how some of the supply chain is going to shift. I think it's something to keep an eye on. Certainly, I think that materials we use have fairly robust supply chains, but as the market for the majority of the proteins like soy or wheat, potato proteins, etc., changes, I think it's something we have to keep an eye on. I don't have an answer to predict how it's going to change.
No problem. All right, thank you. I mean, there are loads coming in. I could spend another probably an hour asking you questions, but surely there'll be some time at the end. So thank you so much for that. And now, last but by no means least, I'd like to welcome Ryan Rakestraw to the screen. So Ryan is the director at Temasek, an investment company headquartered in Singapore that had a net portfolio value of $231 billion last year. So Ryan focuses on the agricultural and food related venture capital investments for the firm, and was instrumental in their recent investment into Perfect Day. So over to you, Ryan. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot. And I'm really happy to be a part of this, and really encouraged to see the global participation in the audience here today. Perhaps a benefit of being able to do this virtually versus getting together in San Francisco. I'm also, very happy with all the kind of comments, the regulatory question, and I'm glad that wasn't directed towards me. But for folks following, looks like a lot of great regulatory advice and links going back and forth on the chat here. So for today, I have a couple of things that I wanted to share. And can you see my screen now?
Yep, we can see your screen, yeah.
Great. So first I'm going to go through kind of my required Temasek introduction, which, we're really trying to build out a presence here in the food and agriculture space. So, want folks to really know and recognize that we're an active investor here across different stages of companies. But then, hopefully it can quickly transition to, some thoughts or observations that myself, my team, and some of our co-investors in various companies have had regarding the sector. Ryan, based with Temasek for the past 2 years, based in our San Francisco office, focused on food and agriculture investing. So Temasek, for those who don't know, a global investment company started in 1974, has appreciated our asset base considerably from $145 million as assets under management in 1974 to $231 billion assets under management as of March 31st of last year, which kind of equates to a total shareholder return of 15% since 1974. We're a global company. We have 800 people staffed in 11 offices around the world. Very diverse company in terms of the types of perspectives and nationalities that we have within our investment team. From an investment standpoint, about 66% of our investments are based in Asia. We've been, which I think is relevant, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But we have been expanding and diversifying globally over the past decade or so. We're a very flexible investment platform. We have the ability to invest publicly and make private investments. We can do early stage investments, which is a number of the things that we've done in food tech and ag tech. We can take control positions or minority positions. Since I've been a part of the firm, I've seen a $5 million investment and also a $4 billion investment. So quite a lot of flexibility in terms of the amount of tickets or checks that we can raise. And we also have, a relatively long investment horizon for the types of investments that we do, which I think are all relevant and applicable to this space. From a firm perspective, we are focused on 6 key themes right now. A lot of the investments in this particular space fall into our sustainable living theme, but we are focused on, other macro trends, longer lifespans, rising affluence, more connected world, smarter systems, and sharing economy. From a food and agriculture perspective, we're investing across the entire agricultural value chain, from things that are very much on the farm level or going into a farm or ranch, up through the production and processing of food products and ingredients, and all the way touching on things that go into food service, retail, or that a consumer eats or buys. We established this dedicated focus on food and agribusiness in 2011. And since that time, we've invested in over 30 companies. And in the past 5 years, we've deployed a little over $5 billion into this space. So, getting in a little bit to the insight, in November of 2019, at a Rethink conference in Singapore, PwC, Rabobank, and Temasek released a report talking about some of the food challenges that are going to occur in Asia over the next decade. This report is publicly available, but I thought I would just, in kind of framing up this discussion, highlight some of the major themes and points. So, from this report, we discussed Asia's inability to feed itself, relying on imports flowing through from long supply chains in the US, in Europe, in South America, and Africa. And we determined that if we were going to build a food system capable of meeting Asia's needs, both in terms of increased amount of food and also changing consumer preference in Asia with respect to food, that about $800 billion of cumulative investment would be required over the next decade. So it's a big number in terms of the the amount of investment and also the opportunity to re-architect the food system in Asia. And then also to just kind of highlight some of the needs and drivers. By 2030, we're looking to add an additional 250 million people in the region, which is roughly the population of Indonesia. Furthermore, Asia is one of the most urbanization is occurring faster than any other region. We'll have 3 cities with greater than 30 million people and 17 of the largest cities in the world. In terms of constraints, there are, from a food production standpoint, a lack of resources in Asia. Even though there's half of the world's population, there's only 1/4 of the world's agricultural land. There's relatively poor infrastructure, which is exemplified by the lack of cold chain capacity. And as I mentioned, earlier, the increase, the opportunity is an increase in food spending and changing consumption. With our report forecasting an increase of $4 trillion of food spend in Asia, doubling by 2030 to $8 trillion. So that's kind of the framing, how we think about, some of the opportunity for these type of technologies, particularly in Asia. So let's get directly into it and talk about microbes in food. Just there were some questions about definition, and so just to be clear, we're not talking about pathogens in food. We're talking about microbes that are either used to produce food or produce a food ingredient. And this is, largely existing stuff. We're talking about beer, bread, we're talking about ingredients. There was a comment, about rennet or chymosin production in the FDA's regulation of that. But a lot of this stuff is already in the food system today. And then I guess while we're talking about this point, I know that there was some discussion about, is plant-based protein included in this? Is mammalian cell culture included in this? I guess, for the purposes of this presentation today, I'm really focused on microbes themselves. So Temasek has a number of investments in companies that are utilizing microbes. I use the term utilizing kind of broadly. Some of these companies are directly using the microbial production systems to produce protein or food that consumers eat. Some of these companies are producing microbes that go into the agricultural process. Some of these are using highly disruptive and innovative approaches, while other companies are using traditional microbial fermentation approaches. All right, so I guess here's kind of some of the heart I wanted to get at. As an investor in this space, looking at it for a little while, wanted to share with you some of the industry observations that our team and some of our co-investors have had. And I guess first I wanted to thank a number of the folks that we work with in the investment space, focused on food and ag tech for sharing some of their thoughts and insights with me. So, we highlighted a little bit of the scale and capacity issues in some of the other talks. For me, when I think about food, versus pharmaceuticals or cosmetics, this is really a question of scale. In the U.S., we're producing, 100 billion liters of milk annually, which is just a massive number when you think about, replicating that process to produce those proteins in a different system. In general, for the emerging companies, the playbook is outsourced production, although CapEx is generally still required. And we've noticed that there's a bit of a gap in, what we call mid-scale production capacity, between 10,000 and 30,000 liters. plenty of like large scale production capacity, plenty of pilot production capacity, but a gap there. From a talent perspective, a lot of folks coming out of school, have familiarity with E. coli, but kind of less familiarity, something that needs to be learned a bit on the job when you look at other organisms and production systems. From a tech development standpoint, interested in organizations that are working on continuous fermentation processes for these approaches versus what's typically a batch fermentation process. And actually, when you survey the industry, some of the limitations are actually in some of the downstream processing, the purification, the formulation steps. I don't want to get into regulatory too much. I mean, I think there's overall positive sentiment. We've cited the impossible FDA GRAS, no questions later, the perfect day GRAS, no objections later. However, and some of the comments, reflect this. It's still I think there's still some caution associated with regulatory approaches. Particularly if you're looking at something that would be very novel, a protein that doesn't exist in nature, for example. From a consumer standpoint, I think that we're similarly a positive trend. A lot of momentum associated with impossible foods and the consumer acceptance there. Although I would say that the synthetic biology content is relatively low in the Impossible Burger. So, as companies like Perfect Day, Clara Foods, Geltor are launching, it's something that I'm very hopeful about and eager to see the consumer receptivity there, which I think is a positive message, associated with the sustainability, environmental impact, animal-free label, clean label product, all things that I think consumers are driven to now. Partnering is a very important aspect for many of these companies. There's various levels of corporate partnering, from things that are simple contract manufacturing arrangements all the way to kind of joint ventures. We've seen kind of the best practice is to leverage the strengths and weaknesses of each organization. For example, we've seen ADM be an effective partner for many emerging companies in this space. Also an active and value-added investor. And related to that, there's probably pretty strong corporate interest, from a variety of companies, food and beverage companies, processing companies, technology companies, interested in this space. From an investment standpoint, you do see a lot of participation from, alternative investors, you see groups, that are VCs, but also a lot of groups that are corporate venture capitals, family offices, foundations, sovereign wealth funds, and crossover investors. And perhaps, Arvind and I can chat about this in the QA, is the, kind of this age-old question of platform versus product, which I would still argue is a debate. All right, COVID thoughts, which I think, not as much kind of focused on like the immediate term, but what are maybe some longer term or medium or longer term implications of COVID right now. I think you will see an increased focus on food security. Again, this is bringing a little bit of this Asian perspective to the table. Likely to see a need for more domestic production in regions where there are constrained agricultural resources like Singapore. And I think these technologies are particularly well suited. Around the world, organizations, consumers, governments are thinking about shorter, more resilient supply chains. I think that you will see an increased focus on food safety and prevention of foodborne diseases. Likely to see increased automation in food production, which I think bodes well for this particular space. And lastly, which in terms of a tailwind, which I think will absolutely true. I think you'll see increased science literacy globally. I know myself and my family, now profess to be vaccine experts. I think, that's probably generally true around the world, where people are more interested in science or the development of these therapeutics. But the headwinds, right now, and maybe more into the medium term, likely to see a more tightening investment environment for early stage, long-term capital intensive projects. Investors likely wanting to see a shorter timeline to commercialization to minimize risk. Ourselves, just like everybody else globally, are expecting productivity impacts in this new normal. Longer development timelines, decreased productivity in the lab, difficulties associated with business development, fewer site visits to contract manufacturers. So, certainly that there will be some impact. So I think that's the material that I had prepared for everyone today. Very happy to participate in this, and really a exciting sector where we're happy to be an existing and continued investor.
Great, thank you so much, Ryan. So I'm going to invite Arvind just to ask you a couple of questions, and then we can invite Ranjani in as well to have a more of a group discussion for the next 10 or 15 minutes. I know we're going to slightly go over time, but everyone's still very engaged with everything, and it's super interesting. So we're going to extend it for a couple more minutes. Over to you.
Great, thank you. So, Ryan, we've known each other for a while now, and Temasek and you are one of the very first believers and investors in this space. So I thank you for that, and I think the whole industry thanks you for that leadership. Now that we're going through this super unprecedented time, you mentioned COVID. One thing that I'm wondering is, how does this actually change consumer behavior around the way they eat? I think one of the things that's interesting to me when I'm ordering food online and things like that from Whole Foods is like what's sold out, what's not, what things are available, what's not. Are people? Do you see people going back to restaurants right away? Do you see people buying packaged foods because the cooking literacy is low, or do you see people like really embracing and engaging in the ability to feed themselves, be healthier, and really understand how and what they eat on a new level, just based on what you're seeing? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's not a simple question. Some of the things that we have observed, from a consumer purchase behavior, was, as folks were restocking, they tended to look for, brands that they were familiar with, versus kind of the momentum before was to, really experiment, try something new products, new brands. There kind of was an emphasis in this stocking up period to go for, things that you knew and have consumed for a long period of time. You're absolutely right in terms of, cooking at home. The numbers associated with meal kit purchases, which were, somewhat declining, have largely reversed. And people talk about that this, like, maybe people didn't even necessarily have the cooking skills, and meal kits was like a great way to get back to learn those skills or get into it. Folks are, I think, absolutely focused on health. You're seeing a lot of increased purchasing of vitamins, of supplements, this type of thing right now, which I think was generally true in any time of crisis. Folks don't want to be going to the doctor, that type of thing. Long term, I think some of these trends that we were seeing pre-COVID, with respect to food and health, will remain true. People understand, whether they're seeing the prevalence of diabetes, globally, some of these other chronic illnesses, the way that impacts, the food that they eat really impacts their health long term.
Yeah, it's interesting. And in terms of the alternative protein market, I mean, just before we really went into lockdown, I was at Whole Foods, and turned out, this is when shelves were kind of empty, and people were really kind of stocking up. And I hung right and into the vegan aisle, and it was still full. And I wondered, like, oh, is this going to be is this where people get more experimental because things are out and they're like, well, I've never tried the vegan cream cheese before, but since I can't get regular cream cheese, I'll just try it, and then, oh, I might really like it. Do you think there's a net opportunity for these companies to try to get distribution right now, or across your portfolio? Are you seeing that, or are you thinking that this is something that because everyone switched back to the name brands that you're talking about, COVID is a hurdle that will have to be climbed for or jumped for these new protein companies?
I mean, the companies that are in our portfolio, I think that there's various supply chain issues, but from a demand perspective, I think it's very strong right now. So people are absolutely buying Califia Farms, Impossible Foods, that type of thing. So, we have seen the demand growth that we were expecting to see pre-COVID out of these companies.
Incredible. That's super exciting, and makes me really happy for the industry and for the companies we work with. So thank you for that. Oliver, would you like to bring on Ranjani now? We could have a discussion. Yeah, awesome. Hi, Ranjani. So I'd love to get both of your opinions really on where do you see this industry headed from here? Like, what are the top, in the interest of time, what's the top hurdle or the number one challenge you see the industry facing in the next 5 years? We'll keep it a relatively short time frame. And the number one opportunity you're seeing for the next 5 years in this industry. Ranjani?
Yeah, so I think there's been a remarkable shift, I think, right? And it's a function of a couple of things. I think both the availability and the innovation in this space around making more compelling alternatives available. And I think rising consumer awareness on the impact of the choices they make on the environment. So that's like in the last 10 years, when I started at Impossible, plant-based meats weren't a thing, but now everybody's talking about them. So I think that, people in this community have done a great job in bringing these technologies to the market. The single biggest challenge, I think, is also the opportunity, which is the ability to, make it fast and make it at scale. So, there are many examples that we've cited where the technology is there. It's a question of how fast can we scale it? How fast can we take it to the market? How do you scale all the supply chain that needs to come into place? So I think the market is prime, like it's ready to start accepting. It's how fast we can bring it to the market. So it's both a challenge and the opportunity, I think.
Great. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge, if companies are using these technologies to ultimately produce a commodity, is getting it down to a cost level that's close to what the existing commodity is. I think that there is some increased willingness to pay, at the consumer or food company level, but it needs to be within range. And related to that, most of the cost is driven by economies of scale. So how is it that you solve this kind of supply demand chicken and egg to get up incrementally to the scale such that you have this great cost?
So scale, it really is the true hurdle. I mean, we've been scaling enzyme and protein production for decades. But do you think the scale required for the costs is just an order of magnitude more than, say, like laundry detergent enzymes, or close to it? Like, let's give the audience a little bit of an understanding what we're talking about in the magnitude of that scaling problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's solvable, but I think it's kind of like the most pertinent challenge for all of these companies. And the enzyme production, in detergents didn't develop overnight, right? We're talking about a decades-long process. I think the challenge is, how do you go from a really long time period in order to achieve that scale to something that's more like a venture frame.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I would say, so I think from Impossible Foods perspective, and I think Ryan referred to this, the microbial technology component is not the main component of the foods that we're making. And one thing to consider is, like you said, what is the cost? But it depends on the usage, really, right? So if the ingredient you are preparing by fermentation is the bulk of your product, then I think we still have a ways to go to reduce the cost, to make the final food be at cheap equivalent price compared to the animal equivalent. I think there's also opportunity to improve the quality and functionality of the other raw materials that go into making these foods. So in Impossible's case, whether it's whatever proteins we use, whether it's soy, wheat, peas, chickpeas, there's a lot of these emerging proteins on the market. They're still limited in terms of the flavor and functionality they offer. I think there's opportunity for the microbial technology platform to do some work to improve that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So really, scaling is kind of. I agree with you. One of the biggest hurdles remaining in that sense to really drive that cost curve down. And Ranjani, that's great. Like, really thinking about that cost relative to its usage within the final product as well. What are things that you guys are looking for that will help solve the problems that are particular to you? For Impossible, are there certain technologies you're looking to acquire, or knowledge bases you're looking to acquire that you aren't necessarily growing in house, or trying to grow in house but looking for help? And Ryan, are you looking for any particular companies in mind, or any technologies that, gosh darn, if you just could, you wish that there's someone was building this, but you haven't seen it just yet. Like, I think this is a great forum to kind of share those kinds of things. So maybe someone can build it if no one else is.
I think for us, it's again access to better raw materials. So there are, for example, soybean, commoditized protein available in very, very, very large scales. But the quality of those proteins is what you see either in your flavored beverages or textured materials, which come with their own characteristic taste and texture, and those are not very easily lending themselves for use in more authentic replications of the meat. So I think Impossible is doing a lot of work to see how can we improve that, but we need, I think, many players to also help us do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that we're thinking about and looking for INDIEBIO to be kind of the leading edge on is like new production format. I mean, maybe not necessarily new, but like different production approaches. I referenced like continuous fermentation, you know, we're also thinking about like gas fermentation systems, solid state fermentation systems.
Yep.
And, you know, relatedly, and I know that you've kind of written about this as well, as like different feedstocks, you know, whether that is, you're looking at, you know, single carbon feedstocks instead of sugars type thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that will greatly diversify the impact of microbial fermentation on the world, which is really what we're all here to do. Thank you both so much for your time. Oliver, thank you so much for organizing this. Always a great event. I'm always honored to be a part of it. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much, guys. That was a brilliant last question to finish on, that really sort of future thinking. So unfortunately, it is our time to finish. You know, I could definitely listen for a couple more hours. I'm sure everyone else could. So thank you so much, firstly, to our speakers for you know, taking the time to share those insights with us, answering those questions. It was a fantastic conversation, and I really do hope that we can host that again soon, and hopefully in person. But thank you again also to you, the audience, for signing on to our first Future Food Tech webinar. Your interest in this really important subject and all of those questions that came through. There were so many that were asked, and so apologies that we couldn't get through all of them. But what we're aiming to do is to get the rest of them collated and then put into a report and answered. So watch out for that. You'll also be able to view the recording of this webinar discussion online this week, and you will receive a link to rewatch or share this with your colleagues. But any feedback, please don't hesitate to reach us. We strive for excellence, and we also have a very thick skin, so any comment goes. And to register for our other online discussions, please head over to futurefoodtech.com and click the webinar link in the top right nav bar. The next is taking place on the 18th of May at the same time, and is our tech showcase. So we'll be featuring 3 really exciting startups within the space who will be pitching to our investor panel, made up of 50 years and joint ventures. So definitely not one to miss. But until then, please stay safe, stay connected, and stay innovating. Speak to you all soon.